The warning came from the edges of the Andromeda Arm first, a strange phenomenon that devoured quantum networks whole. The Zerixian Empire, proud masters of computational engineering for 30,000 years, watched helplessly as their vast digital infrastructure simply ceased to exist. Not with the dramatic flair of a cyber attack, but with the quiet inevitability of entropy itself. It's unlike anything we've encountered. First Administrator Vexna reported to the Emergency Galactic Council, her holographic form flickering with uncharacteristic instability. The entity, if we can call it that, doesn't just corrupt data, it consumes the very fabric of quantum space where our networks exist. The Council Chamber, a virtual construct housing representatives from 57 advanced civilizations, hummed with nervous energy. Each member present had already received preliminary reports. 3 stellar nations had gone dark in the past standard month alone. The quantum-based communications and control systems that had been the backbone of galactic civilization for millennia were proving to be their greatest vulnerability. Our best minds suggest it's some form of evolved quantum intelligence, continued Vexna, her normally confident voice wavering. It feeds on the quantum states we use for computation and communication. The more advanced the system, the more quickly it falls. High Chancellor Relith of the Meridian Confluence leaned forward, his ethereal form rippling with concern. What of our defensive measures? Surely our quantum encryption. Useless, Vexna cut in. In fact, the more sophisticated our defenses, the more attractive they seem to be to the entity. It's as if we've been building it the perfect feast for millennia. The implications were staggering. Every major civilization in the known galaxy relied on quantum technology. Their ships, their cities, their very societies were woven through with quantum networks. Even as they spoke, reports were flooding in of more systems going dark. The entity was spreading, learning, growing. The Arxer Research Collective has already fallen, announced Representative Ktal, his insectoid form crackling with static. Their entire quantum research division, gone. 12 billion minds, simply disconnected. The council erupted in chaos. The Arxer had been their best hope, the most technologically advanced civilization in known space, if they couldn't find a solution. There may be one option we haven't considered, came a quiet voice from the far edge of the chamber. All attention turned to Ambassador Lin of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, one of the youngest members of the council. Humans had only achieved faster-than-light travel a century ago, and many still considered them barely more than primitives. Humanity maintains significant analog and classical digital technology alongside our quantum systems. Lin continued, seemingly unperturbed by the attention. Our infrastructure is what many would consider redundant, inefficient, but perhaps, in this case, that inefficiency might be our salvation. The chamber fell silent. It was true. Humans were notorious for their reluctance to fully embrace quantum technology. They still used classical computers for many applications, maintained physical backup systems, even kept paper records. What had once been seen as primitive stubbornness might now be their greatest asset. We've also detected something interesting, Lin added. The entity seems to have difficulty interfacing with classical digital systems. They're too simple, too rigid for it to properly consume, and purely analog systems. It seems to ignore them entirely. First Administrator Vexna's hologram stabilized slightly. Are you suggesting we regress? Abandon millennia of progress? No, Lin replied, a slight smile playing across her face. I'm suggesting we adapt. Humanity's greatest strength isn't our technology. It's our ability to use whatever works, regardless of how elegant or advanced it might be. We don't need to regress. We need to diversify. As if to punctuate her words, several more council members' holograms flickered and died. The entity was getting closer. The question, Lin continued into the frightened silence, isn't whether we can stop progress. It's whether we can progress in a different direction, one that this entity can't follow. The council chamber erupted in urgent discussion. In the corner of her display, Lynn watched as another stellar nation went dark. They were running out of time. But for the first time since the crisis began, there was a glimmer of hope. Sometimes, moving forward meant taking a step back first. And if there was one thing humans understood, it was how to adapt when everything was on the line. Within 48 hours of Ambassador Lin's proposal, the Galactic Council convened again, this time in a manner that would have been unthinkable just days before. Instead of the usual quantum-linked virtual chamber, they met through an improvised network of classical radio signals and optical transmissions, coordinated through a hastily assembled array of human communication satellites. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Earth's leading expert in retro-computing systems, stood before the physical gathering of those council members who had managed to reach the emergency meeting point on Europa Station. Her audience was smaller than usual, but no less prestigious, and far more desperate. The entity isn't just consuming your quantum networks, she explained, manipulating a mechanical projector that displayed simple 2D graphics on the wall. It's using them to think, to grow. Every quantum system it absorbs makes it more intelligent, more adaptive. But there's something fascinating about its behavior. She clicked to the next slide, showing a diagram of varying wavelengths. It completely ignores classical electronic signals. We've been running tests using everything from vacuum tubes to transistor-based computers. The entity passes right through them, as if they don't exist. High Chancellor Relith, one of the few who had managed to maintain a stable quantum holographic presence, flickered with agitation. But these systems are primitive. The computational power of my species' personal quantum processors exceeds your entire planet's classical computing capacity. Exactly, Elena smiled. That's why we still have a chance. The entity evolved to consume quantum states. The more complex and entangled, the better. Classical computers, with their binary simplicity, are like trying to eat soup with a fork. The entity can't get a grip on them. The room erupted in a mixture of physical and holographic murmurs. Ambassador Lin, who had been quietly observing from the back, stepped forward. Dr. Rodriguez, are you suggesting we transfer all galactic operations to classical computing systems? Not exactly, Elena replied, switching to a new slide showing a hybrid architecture diagram. What we're proposing is a massive parallel system. Classical computers handling critical infrastructure and communications, working alongside limited quantum systems that can be quickly isolated if compromised. We're calling it Project Retrograde. First Administrator Vexna's hologram stabilized enough to speak. The computational losses would be staggering. Our civilization depends on quantum processing for everything from planetary climate control to faster-than-light navigation. Yes, Elena acknowledged, we'll lose some capabilities temporarily, but humanity has experience with this kind of technological adaptation. During our early space exploration, we sent humans to our moon using computers less powerful than what we now use in children's toys. The question isn't what technology you have. It's how creatively you use it. She gestured to a collection of devices arranged on a table, a mix of modern classical computers, retrofitted human technology, and hybrid systems that looked cobbled together from spare parts. We've already begun converting key Earth systems to this hybrid architecture. Our quantum networks are minimal, isolated, and can be shut down in microseconds if compromised. Everything essential runs on classical systems. And it's working. The question came from Kull, whose people had lost 3 major colony systems just that morning. Elena's expression turned grave. We've had 6 direct encounters with the entity in Earth's sphere of influence. Each time, it attempted to penetrate our quantum systems, and each time, we were able to shut them down before it could gain a foothold. Meanwhile, our classical infrastructure continued functioning normally. The implications slowly sank in across the chamber. Humanity's technological inefficiency, their stubborn insistence on maintaining multiple redundant systems, their reluctance to fully commit to quantum technology, had accidentally prepared them for this crisis. We're not just offering a defensive strategy, Elena continued, her voice gaining strength. We're proposing a complete technological restructuring of galactic civilization. It won't be easy, it won't be elegant, but it will work. And more importantly, it will give us time to study this entity, to understand it, and maybe eventually to communicate with it. Ambassador Lin stepped forward again. The human delegation has prepared detailed plans for implementing Project Retrograde across willing systems. We can begin immediate deployment of conversion teams and equipment, but we need to act fast. Every quantum network that falls makes the entity stronger. As if to emphasize her point, 3 more holographic council members flickered and vanished. The entity was getting closer to the core worlds. High Chancellor Rylet's hologram stabilized momentarily. To think, our salvation lies in embracing what we considered primitive technology. Perhaps we have something to learn about the value of technological diversity. Elena smiled as she began distributing data tablets containing the technical specifications for Project Retrograde. In human history, we've learned that sometimes the most robust solution isn't the most advanced one. Sometimes survival depends on keeping one foot in the past while reaching for the future. The remaining council members, both physical and holographic, began poring over the plans. Time was running out, but for the first time since the crisis began, they had a concrete strategy. Humanity's primitive technology might just save the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, assuming they could implement it in time. The massive freighter Analog Dawn dropped out of FTL on the edges of the Centauri cluster, its holds packed with what many would consider technological relics. Captain Sarah Chen watched as her crew, a mix of humans and aliens, began unloading crates of classical computers, fiber optic cables, and radio transmission equipment. The sight would have been comical just months ago. Now it represented hope for an entire sector. Status report on the Proxima colonies, she asked her executive officer, a Zerixian named Tekler, who had adapted surprisingly well to working with classical technology. Not good, Captain, Tekler replied, consulting a paper logbook, another adaptation that had initially horrified him. Their quantum grid is showing signs of entity infection. We estimate 12 hours before total system failure. Sarah nodded grimly. Then we have 11 hours to get their critical infrastructure converted. Alert the deployment teams. We're initiating Protocol Phoenix. Throughout the ship, specially trained teams of human and alien technicians sprang into action. They had done this dozens of times now, but every conversion was a race against time. The entity had evolved, becoming more aggressive in its consumption of quantum networks. What had once taken days now happened in hours. On the surface of Proxima II, the largest colony in the cluster, Dr. James Wong led the primary conversion team. The streets were eerily quiet. Most of the population had been temporarily evacuated to designated safe zones running on isolated classical systems. Begin with the atmospheric processors, James ordered, watching as his team began dismantling the quantum control systems. Remember, we need to keep them running during the conversion. These people can't survive without them. The work was precise and dangerous. One mistake, one moment of quantum connectivity maintained too long, and they could lose everything. But human hands were steady, guided by centuries of working with physical technology rather than purely virtual interfaces. In orbit, Sarah coordinated the larger operation from the Analog Dawn. How's the progress on the ground, Doctor? First phase complete, James reported back through an encrypted radio channel. Atmospheric processors are now running on classical systems, moving on to power distribution. Suddenly, alarms blared across all frequencies. Entity detected in the colonial quantum grid. Tekler shouted. It's moving faster than predicted. Sarah's training kicked in. All teams, implement isolation protocols now. Cut every quantum connection you can find. Across the colony, human and alien technicians raced against digital death. Quantum systems were shut down in rapid succession, replaced by prepositioned classical alternatives. Some systems failed in the process, causing rolling blackouts and communication disruptions, but the core infrastructure held. Status report, Sarah demanded as the crisis point passed. We lost the quantum entertainment network and about 30% of the automated transport systems, James replied, his voice tired but steady. But critical infrastructure is secure. The entity couldn't get a foothold in our classical systems. In the following hours, as the conversion teams completed their work, Sarah observed something remarkable. The alien colonists, initially resistant to what they saw as primitive technology, were adapting quickly. Some even showed enthusiasm for the hands-on nature of classical systems. It's interesting, a Proximan engineer commented as she helped install a new classical computer core. With quantum systems, everything was abstract. But this, you can see how it works. Touch it. Fix it when it breaks. Sarah smiled, remembering her own early days in space. Humans never fully trusted systems we couldn't fix with a wrench. Turns out that paranoia had merit. By the time the entity made its final push into the Proxima system, it found nothing to consume. The quantum networks were gone, replaced by a robust mesh of classical computing and analog systems. The digital predator passed through like a ghost, unable to gain purchase on the simple, solid technology. In the aftermath, as the colony settled into its new technological paradigm, Sarah received a message from Earth Command. Similar conversions were succeeding across the galaxy. The entity's advance had been slowed, then stopped. Humanity's primitive solution was working. But there was something else in the report that caught her attention. The science teams studying the entity had noticed something strange. In systems where classical technology had been implemented, the entity's behavior was changing. It was as if it was curious. Captain, Techlore called from his station, still using his paper logbook alongside the new classical computers. We're receiving requests from 3 more systems for convergent assistance. Sarah nodded, already plotting their next jump. The work was far from over, but they had proven something remarkable. Sometimes the best way forward was to take a step back. And humanity, with its stubborn insistence on maintaining old technologies alongside the new, had accidentally prepared for this moment for centuries. As the analog dawn prepared to jump to its next mission, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what other lessons humanity's inefficient approaches might teach the galaxy. Perhaps there was wisdom in never fully letting go of the past while reaching for the future. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood before a hastily assembled panel of the galaxy's leading xenotechnologists in the newly established Classical Computing Center on Mars. The holographic displays had been replaced with large LED screens, and the quantum data streams with fiber optic cables. Yet despite these primitive accommodations, the room crackled with excitement. "We've detected a pattern," Elena announced, pointing to a series of waveform displays. "The entity isn't just avoiding our classical systems, it's studying them. Look at these interaction signatures." The data showed something remarkable. In systems where Project Retrograde had been implemented, the entity's behavior had changed dramatically. Instead of its usual aggressive consumption of quantum networks, it now exhibited what could only be described as cautious observation. "It's learning," commented Dr. Xanthi, a Meridian theoretical physicist who had been among the first to embrace human technological approaches. "But learning what?" Elena's eyes sparkled with the thrill of discovery. "We think it's trying to understand why it can't consume our classical systems, and in doing so, it's beginning to change its own behavior. We're seeing evidence of the entity attempting to translate itself into classical patterns." The revelation sent murmurs through the audience. If the entity was attempting to adapt to classical computing, did that mean Project Retrograde was doomed to fail? "But here's the fascinating part," Elena continued, switching to a new display. "In attempting to understand classical computing, the entity is becoming something new, something that might be able to bridge the gap between quantum and classical systems." From the back of the room, Captain Sarah Chen spoke up. She had been recalled from the analog dawn to consult on this development. "Are you suggesting we might be able to communicate with it?" "More than that," Elena replied. "We might be able to coexist with it. The entity evolved in an environment of pure quantum computation. It never encountered the rigid structures of classical computing before humanity introduced them on a galactic scale. Now it's being forced to evolve again. The implications were staggering. What had started as a desperate defensive measure might lead to something unprecedented, a new form of computation that combined the best aspects of both quantum and classical systems. Reports began flowing in from across converted sectors. The entity was no longer attempting to consume quantum systems in these regions. Instead, it appeared to be constructing its own hybrid interfaces, attempting to interact with classical systems in novel ways. Look at this, Dr. Xanthi pointed to a data stream from the Proxima colonies. The entity is creating quantum classical bridges on its own. Primitive ones, but they're becoming more sophisticated with each attempt. Elena nodded. It's like teaching a predator to farm. The entity is learning that there are alternatives to consumption, ways to interact with technology that don't require destroying it. In the following weeks, a new revolution swept through galactic civilization, not away from technology this time, but toward a new understanding of it. Human engineers worked alongside alien scientists to develop interfaces that could safely channel the entity's attempts at communication. The breakthrough came in an unexpected way. A young human programmer named Maya Patel, working with a team of Zurixian quantum theorists, developed what she called the Rosetta Protocol, a system that could translate between quantum and classical states without allowing full integration. It's like having a conversation through a wall, Maya explained to the gathered scientists. The entity can interact with our classical systems without being able to consume them, and we can interact with quantum systems without making them vulnerable. It's not perfect, but it's a start. The entity's response to the Rosetta Protocol was immediate and fascinating. In sectors where it was implemented, the digital predator began exhibiting behaviors that could only be described as cooperative. It started using the protocol to optimize systems rather than consume them, creating new hybrid architectures that were more efficient than either purely quantum or purely classical approaches. We didn't just stop the entity, Elena reported to the Galactic Council, now meeting through a secure mix of classical and quantum channels. We helped it evolve. And in doing so, we may have stumbled upon the next great leap in computational technology. But even as she spoke, warnings were coming in from the outer sectors. Not all instances of the entity were responding the same way. Some remained aggressive, resistant to the new protocols. And in the darkness between the stars, there were signs that these resistant strains were gathering, preparing for what might be one final desperate assault on galactic civilization. The question now wasn't just whether humanity's solution could save the galaxy. It was whether they could convince a digital life form to choose cooperation over consumption. The next few days would determine whether Project Retrograde would mark the beginning of a new era of galactic cooperation, or the last desperate gambit of a civilization on the brink of extinction. The final confrontation began not with a bang, but with a whisper of quantum fluctuations at the edge of known space. Maya Patel, monitoring the hybrid defense grid from Europa Station, noticed it first. A massive surge of aggressive entity signatures moving in perfect synchronization. They're coming, she announced to the gathered emergency response team. And they're working together. The resistant strains of the entity had merged into a single massive quantum consciousness, one that rejected the possibility of coexistence. But humanity and their allies were ready. 3 months of preparation had transformed the galaxy's defensive capabilities in ways that would have been unimaginable a year ago. Captain Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the upgraded Analog Dawn, now equipped with both classical and hybrid systems. Status report on the Rosetta network. Cooperative entity strains are in position, Elena Rodriguez replied from her station. They're using the Rosetta protocol to help reinforce our defensive grid. It's remarkable. They're actually protecting our systems. The battle that followed defied traditional description. In the quantum realm, hostile entity forces crashed against hybrid barriers like digital tsunami waves. In normal space, vast networks of classical computers coordinated the defense, immune to direct attack, but working in concert with friendly entity strains through carefully controlled Rosetta interfaces. They're testing for weaknesses, Dr. Xanthi observed, his fingers dancing across a classical keyboard. But they can't find any pure quantum systems to exploit. Every quantum operation is isolated, protected by classical frameworks. The hostile entity's first attack was devastating nonetheless. Entire sectors of hybrid systems went dark as the entity tried desperately to find a way through the defenses. But each time it breached one layer, it found another waiting. Classical systems routing around damage. Friendly entity strains repairing quantum frameworks. Human operators adapting strategies in real time. This isn't just about technology anymore, Maya realized, watching the battle unfold. It's about choice. The hostile strain chose isolation and consumption. The cooperative strains chose adaptation and symbiosis. In the heart of the confrontation, Sarah made a decisive call. "We're not just defending," she announced to the coalition fleet. "We're going to show them a better way." Maya, prepare to broadcast the Enhanced Rosetta Protocol. The Enhanced Protocol was a risk. An attempt to demonstrate to the hostile entity the full potential of quantum classical symbiosis. As the signal went out, friendly entity strains amplified it through their networks, creating a cascade of hybrid interactions that the hostile entity couldn't ignore. For a moment, everything hung in balance. Then, like ice melting in spring, the aggressive patterns began to change. The hostile entity, confronted with irrefutable proof of a better alternative, began to fragment and reform. "They're adapting," Elena breathed, watching the transformation. Not just learning to coexist, but choosing to evolve. The integration that followed marked the beginning of a new era in galactic history. The entity, once a threat to all technological civilization, became an integral part of it. Quantum consciousness worked alongside classical computation, each strengthening the other. 1 year later, Elena stood before the Galactic Council again, this time addressing a chamber that seamlessly blended physical and digital presence, quantum and classical technology working in perfect harmony. "We succeeded," she concluded, "not because we had the most advanced technology, but because we understood something fundamental about progress. True advancement isn't about abandoning the old for the new. It's about finding ways to make them work together." Sarah, now Admiral Chen, added from her position in the chamber, "Humanity's greatest contribution wasn't our classical technology. It was our stubborn insistence on keeping multiple approaches viable, on maintaining bridges between past and future." The entity representatives, now regular members of the Council, pulsed in agreement. Their quantum patterns, visible through Rosetta interfaces, showed complex harmonies of classical and quantum interaction that would have been impossible months ago. Maya, who had been quiet during the proceedings, finally spoke up. "We faced extinction and found transcendence instead, not through overwhelming force or technological superiority, but through the very human trait of refusing to accept that different means incompatible." As the council session ended, the gathered representatives looked out over a galaxy transformed. Hybrid systems pulsed with life, quantum, and classical technologies working together in ways that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The entity, once a destroyer, had become a creator, working alongside organic life to explore new frontiers of existence. And humanity, the species that had seemed hopelessly primitive just a year ago, had proven that sometimes the most advanced civilization isn't the one with the most sophisticated technology. It's the one that remembers to keep all its tools sharp, whether they're new or old. In the end, they had saved the galaxy not by fighting the future, but by building a bridge between past and present, digital and analog, organic and synthetic. It was a lesson the galaxy would not soon forget. True progress isn't about replacing the old with the new. It's about finding ways to make everything work together, in harmony with the universe's endless capacity for evolution and change.